It's becoming harder and harder to play our old games. Not only because the inputs on these old consoles are different, but because these old consoles have a shelf life. They're slowly dying as they sit there collecting dust. And it's not like anybody's keeping up production on these retro consoles anymore. It's not like you can just run out to the store and buy a brand new one, right? Or can you? Of course, you know it, it's part of the title. Analogue has created modernized versions of the Neo Geo, the NES, the Super NES, and most recently, the Sega Genesis. This little guy packs in a lot of features, but it makes playing your Genesis games on modern TVs as simple and as beautiful as possible while maintaining the authenticity of the original hardware, which should get you just as excited as it gets me. Please, I need somebody to share this excitement with. We've covered ways to get the best picture out of your retro consoles before, but this is a little bit different. This is just straight up a whole new console. It takes actual Sega Genesis cartridges, but unlike other cheaper retro-inspired hardware, the Analogue Mega Sg is not an emulator. See, consoles like Hyperkin's Retron 5 are great, but they rip the ROM off of the cartridge and then emulate the original console using software. It's not actually running the game off of the cartridge. In fact, if copyright wasn't an issue, you could just rip the cartridge right out of the console because it's not even using the cartridge after you initially boot it up. This is fine for a lot of games, probably most games, but some games will run just a little bit faster or a little bit slower than they're supposed to, or maybe the music will sound all weird, or maybe the game just might not work at all. Virtua Racing for the Sega Genesis has extra hardware inside of the cartridge, so ripping the ROM off of the cartridge just won't work at all. Gargoyles is another good example. Because of the way it was written, it requires a very specific chip setup on the Genesis itself in order to work properly. Gargoyles doesn't even run on a Sega Genesis Model 3 because the Model 3 doesn't support task instructions. The Analogue Mega Sg does, because it's just a straight rip of a Sega Genesis console. In fact, what you're seeing right now is running off of a Mega Sg, although this particular footage is from a ROM, but we'll get to that later. The analog consoles use an FPGA chip, which can be used to replicate virtually any chip on a schematic level. They've basically used new technology to create a little tiny Sega Genesis that runs identically to an original Sega Genesis. It even has the same controller ports if you want the most authentic experience and want to use your old controllers. But I'd recommend shelling out the extra couple of bucks for the 8BitDo M30 gamepad. It includes a dongle that plugs wirelessly into the Analogue's controller port. This will even work on an OG Sega Genesis since the port is the same. This controller is offered as an add-on on Analogue's website. The buttons feel identical to an original 6-button Sega Genesis controller, except, of course, newer and the plastic isn't glossy. Also, the controller isn't boomerang shaped, but it still fits in the hands nicely. 8BitDo also makes a Bluetooth version of this controller. This version will work on the Switch, and you can get a dongle to make it work on a Sega Genesis if you want. But the extra buttons aren't mapped correctly for the Switch. It basically only works with Street Fighter just because of the way the shoulder buttons default to the C and Z buttons. Not even the Sega Genesis Classics collection on the Switch has a way to remap the controls. So I'd say it's not worth having for the Switch, unless you're that one guy who's really used to playing Street Fighter with the Sega Genesis controller specifically. Just get the 2.4 gigahertz one from the Analogue website at the discounted rate because you're only going to want to use this thing with the Analogue Mega Sg anyway. When you turn the system on, you're greeted with this lovely analog boot screen. Then you have this minimal option menu where you can load the cartridge you have inserted, or you can play Ultra Core, which is an Analogue exclusive Sega Genesis game. It was developed in 1994 under the name Hardcore, but it was canceled by the publisher just before release. This is the only way that you could play this game today. Kind of like how they released Star Fox 2 with the SNES Classic. I love how these companies are just releasing their vaulted up IPs, games that have been finished for over 20 years. We finally get a chance to play them, legitimately. Ultra Core is kind of like a Metroidvania with Contra controls. It's cool to have for the novelty, Probably not going to be your new favorite game though. Right out of the gate, the Analogue is set up to give you the largest, sharpest pixels with a 4:3 aspect ratio at a solid 1080p, 60 frames per second. No need to tinker at all like you would with another upscaler like, let's say, the OSSC. For me, these are the exact settings that I'd want, and they come right out of the box. But of course, if you do like to tinker, there are plenty of options available. You can add scan lines, you can blur the pixels, you can even adjust the scaling if you only want 720p, and so on. But if you don't want to screw around, the Mega SG is set up so you can get right to playing as quickly as possible. You can even disable the boot screen entirely so it loads right into the game if you want. You know, like how a Sega Genesis actually runs. After playing my first game on here, I realized just how much I need to clean the contacts on my OG Sega Genesis. I'm always taking the cartridge out, blowing on it, plugging it back in, turning the system on, turning it off again, taking the cartridge out, blowing on it, plugging it back in, turning the system on, turning it off again, taking the cartridge out, blowing on it. Turns out the cartridges are just fine because they run immediately on the Analogue. It's amazing to have old hardware that just works. It's literally breathing new life into my old cartridges. Although sometimes with these double stacked cartridges, I have to try more than once. As far as gameplay is concerned, it's just a Sega Genesis, so it runs exactly the same as a Sega Genesis. It's just much easier to get it running on a modern TV with no input lag and getting it to look nice and crisp. You're also getting a native 1080p signal, not a weird 960p or 1200p that you might get from something like the OSSC. So it's much easier to capture gameplay footage from the Analogue. It might also be easier for certain TVs to read this signal. Analogue also made it super easy to update the firmware, which is the first thing I did and the first thing that they recommend that you do. You just drop it on an SD card, slap that sucker into the side of your Mega SG, and turn the system on. The light will blink for a few minutes while it flashes the new firmware. That's it. Analogue also made it purposely easy to jailbreak the console. It was jailbroken pretty much immediately after release, which is also super easy to do. It's exactly the same as flashing the firmware. This jailbreak made by Smoke Monster is super unobtrusive. All it does is add an extra line on the main menu called Cores. Selecting that reveals Genesis, Game Gear, Master System, and ColecoVision options. These are your new emulators. You can now drop ROMs onto an SD card and play them on your Analogue Mega SG using actual Sega hardware. It's just like having an EverDrive for your Sega Genesis, except it's 1080p. And yes, it runs Gargoyles just fine, like I showed you before. Not virtual racing though. Unfortunately, that requires extra hardware that is built into the cartridge. Kind of like how Star Fox requires the Super FX chip, you know what I'm talking about. Sonic Chaos for the Game Gear runs exactly as well as it does on the Game Gear, meaning not too great, but you know what? At least it's there. This is the first Analogue console that I've ever owned, and it makes me want all of their other ones. Its ease of use and the graphical fidelity that it achieves makes it well worth the cost, and it kind of shit all over the hardware that I have already. It's been really hard to convey my enthusiasm for this console in this video. As a collector, I enjoy playing on original hardware. Yes, I use emulators too. Sometimes you just want to play something and emulators are the easiest way to do it. Sometimes they even look the best too, if it's like an N64 game like Star Fox. I keep talking about Star Fox. But you're not going to get crisper polygons than that. But in some cases, that just isn't an option. Like, I can use a Game Genie on this thing. I can tinker around with the Sonic and Knuckles cart. This thing even has an expansion slot for a Sega CD. But even when emulators are a viable option, playing on original hardware still feels the best. Nothing beats buying a cartridge at a flea market and popping it in yourself. Or playing the exact same cartridge you played a million times over as a kid. You can pick up that same Sonic 3 save file. No need to blow on it a million times. No need to break out the OSSC or a similar upscaler to make it work on your HD TV. This is by far the best way to play your Sega Genesis games, if you're not already on the Sega Genesis Classics collection for the Switch. And Sonic 3 isn't. So you know what? Yes, this is the best way to play your Sega Genesis games. Now I just want that Super NT. So what do you guys think about the Analogue Mega Sg or Analogue as a company in general? Are you interested in getting a console to play all of your retro games on, your original hardware? Is there any console that you would like to see remade today by Analogue? Leave it in the comments below. Add me on Twitter, any and all of this other social media garbage. I know the Sega Genesis isn't that popular among people. It's not popular among our own audience, but that's what we grew up on. And I'm super interested in that library. Whenever I go to a retro game store or a flea market, that's the section I gravitate towards the most. And you know what? I'm always disappointed by how small the Sega Genesis section is. But I was super blown away by the Mega Sg and just how solid it feels. It feels like a boutique piece of gaming hardware. It's not like one of these hacked together freaking like retro pies or Android with RetroArch. It's not like that. It feels like a solid piece of gaming hardware. It feels like I just walked out of the Apple store with a Sega Genesis. It's awesome. Anyway, we got new videos and live streams all the time. Our schedule is usually in a pinned tweet over on our Twitter. We also got Wulff Den live every single Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern time. That's our live podcast where we can talk to each other. We also got live streams over on twitch.tv/WulffDen. If you support us here on YouTube or over on twitch.tv, you can even use Amazon Prime. You link it to your Twitch account, you got Twitch Prime. If you support us, link that to your Discord account. You get videos like this one early. You get private chat time with us. You even get priority when we play games together once a month. But of course, the most important thing that you can do to help support us is just subscribe to the channel. That's the easiest. And share this video with a friend who is as into this retro stuff as I am, because I need more friends to nerd out about this shit over. Thank you guys very much. You have yourself a very good week.